Rome fell. Everyone knows that part. But what most people don't tell you is what happened to the money. What happened not just to the legions, not just to the borders, not just to the state, but to the very foundation of wealth itself. Half a millennium of civilization didn't simply end. It evaporated in the span of a single generation. Fortunes built over centuries vanished. Silver savings turned into garbage. The retirement funds of soldiers who had spent 25 years holding the frontier collapsed into dust. And yet some families didn't just survive the collapse. They came out of it richer than they had gone in. They lost the old form of wealth, but they kept what survived the catastrophe itself. 4 assets. 4 things that didn't merely preserve value during one of the most devastating economic breakdowns in history, but transferred enormous fortunes to the people who understood what to hold. One of those assets is something any modern financial advisor would call reckless, dangerous, almost irresponsible. But the Romans who held it didn't just survive the fall, they profited from it. To understand what endured, you first have to understand what destroyed the Roman economy. Because Rome didn't die from barbarians alone. First, it died from its money. The denarius, the silver coin that sat at the center of Rome's economy from Britain to Syria, was nearly pure silver under Augustus. It held the wages of soldiers, the profits of merchants, the savings of farmers. It wasn't just a coin, it was trust made solid. Then came the bills, running an empire that stretched across continents, while defending the north against Germanic tribes and the east against Persia, cost more money than any tax system could raise fast enough. So the emperors did what governments have done throughout history when they can't pay their debts. They debased the currency. By the reign of Caracalla in the early 3rd century, the silver content of the denarius had already dropped sharply. The coin still looked the same, carried the same imperial seal, and claimed the same value, but half the silver had quietly been replaced with base metal. By the middle of the 3rd century, under Gallienus, it was even worse. The denarius had become nearly worthless as silver. On the outside, it still looked like an imperial coin. On the inside, it was almost an empty shell. The Roman people noticed. People always do. Prices rose. Merchants stopped accepting debased coins for imports. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Farmers refused to hand over grain for money that no longer meant anything. The vast trade network that had bound tens of millions of people together began to fracture at every seam. Between 235 and 284 AD, in what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome suffered military collapse, plague, civil war, and economic breakdown all at once. Nearly 50 years of chaos, dozens of claimants to power, emperors rising and falling in months. The empire that had seemed eternal was coming apart like wet paper. Against that backdrop, you can see what actually held its value. Asset number 1, the right kind of gold. Everyone says gold survived Rome's fall. That's true, but the version of that story most people hear leaves out the most important part. And that missing piece has cost people fortunes in every collapse since. Here's the full picture. When Constantine consolidated power in the early 4th century, he introduced a new coin, the solidus. It was 24-karat gold, about 4.5 grams, struck to a consistent purity and weight across the empire's mints. No debasement, no silver wash, no political games with the metal content. The solidus wasn't just a coin. It was a declaration of war against the monetary decay that had been eating Rome from the inside for a century. The market responded immediately. Merchants who had been forced to settle major transactions in grain, silk, or raw materials because no one trusted the denarius anymore suddenly had a reliable medium of exchange again. The solidus became the currency of the wealthy, the internationally connected, and anyone who needed to do serious business across political borders. For the next 7 centuries, long after the western half of Rome had dissolved into competing Germanic kingdoms, the solidus remained the backbone of Mediterranean commerce. Byzantine merchants were still using it in the 11th century. A Roman senator who held his wealth in debased denarii in 300 AD was financially ruined by 360. The same senator who had converted that wealth into gold, specifically gold of verified and consistent purity, could maintain his economic position through the worst of the collapse. But there's a layer to this story that usually gets left out. Not all gold was equal. The underground gold market in 3rd century Rome was chaotic. Clipped coins, adulterated bars, fake weights, they were everywhere. The people who survived weren't just the ones who held gold. They were the ones who held gold that could be independently verified, weighed, tested, trusted by the other side of a transaction without needing any institutional backing. Kyle Harper's research on Rome's economic collapse shows that the wealthy increasingly demanded payment in aurum, pure gold by weight, rather than in any particular coin. They had already learned the core lesson. The coin was a political instrument and could be manipulated. The metal itself was the store of value. That distinction between the asset and the paper claim on the asset is not a Roman problem. It is the permanent condition of every monetary system under stress. Rome didn't teach us that gold is safe. Rome taught us that what cannot be diluted cannot be debased. Which brings us to the most counterintuitive thing that happened during Rome's collapse. Sit with this for a moment, because what comes next is the kind of insight that changes the way you read the history of money. Asset number 2, debt. This is the one nobody talks about. Financial historians know it. The academic literature documents it carefully, but it almost never makes it into popular conversations about Rome's fall. During Rome's hyperinflation, being a debtor was an asset. Here's exactly what that means. A Roman landowner takes out a loan of 100,000 denarii in 200 AD. At that moment, that amount is a real fortune, enough to buy a productive agricultural estate outside the city. By 280 AD, 100,000 denarii buys roughly what a few sacks of grain would have cost in 200 AD. The silver content of the denarius has collapsed by more than 90%. Prices have risen in lockstep, but the loan is still denominated in nominal denarii. The contract says 100,000, and 100,000 is what gets repaid. Except those 100,000 in 280 AD represent only a tiny fraction of what they meant when the debt was created. The borrower repaid the loan in money that had become functionally worthless. The lender, whoever had extended credit in good silver-heavy denarii, got back bronze coins with a thin silver wash. Inflation didn't just erode the currency. It systematically transferred wealth from creditors to debtors on an empire-wide scale. Every fixed debt obligation denominated in nominal denarii became cheaper and cheaper to repay in real terms as the currency collapsed. The borrower's land remained. The debt's purchasing power did not. Roman historians document this pattern in the behavior of the senatorial class throughout the crisis. Those who had leveraged their land holdings with debt in the 2nd century found themselves by the late 3rd century holding enormous real assets, productive farmland, urban property, grain warehouses, while their debt obligations had been inflated away to almost nothing. Peter Heather's analysis of the Roman aristocracy in the period after the Western Empire's collapse shows a striking pattern. The great landed families maintained extraordinary economic power even through the empire's final breakdown. They weren't just surviving. Some were negotiating political arrangements with Visigothic and Frankish leaders from positions of real strength. Their advantage as debtors had given them something more valuable than liquid savings. It gave them real assets, free from obligations that had once seemed crushing. Brian Ward Perkins, whose archaeological work on the post-Roman world documents collapse through objects, buildings, and pottery shards, points out that while ordinary Romans saw their standard of living collapse catastrophically, the great villa estates of the aristocracy continued operating. Not at their peak, not with the complexity they had once maintained, but they still functioned. They produced. They sustained life inside their walls. Joseph Tainter's framework for understanding collapse gets to the same point. When complex systems fail, they fail unevenly. The nodes that survive are the ones holding real productive capacity with minimal external dependence. Roman aristocrats whose debt had been inflated away were exactly those kinds of nodes. Everything outside them was failing. Inside the estate walls, life continued. This pattern didn't begin with Rome, and it didn't end there. The Weimar hyperinflation of 1923 produced the same dynamic with mathematical precision. German industrialists who had borrowed heavily to build factories and manufacturing capacity paid off those loans in marks worth less than the paper they were printed on. They ended up owning real capital free and clear while their creditors, the savers, the bondholders, the retirees, were economically annihilated. Inflation is not simply a tax, it is a wealth transfer mechanism. And in that transfer, the direction of advantage almost always runs the same way, away from people holding paper claims and toward people holding real assets financed with debt in a collapsing currency. The Romans had no name for that principle, but the families who understood it, whether by instinct or calculation, came through the fall of an empire with their positions intact. Asset number 3, the self-sufficient estate. Land alone didn't save you. That distinction is critical, and it's the part most simplified versions of this story miss completely. Rome at its height was a deeply interconnected economy. Spanish olive oil shipped to Britain. Egyptian grain fed the capital. Syrian purple dye clothed senators. The supply chain was astonishingly complex for the ancient world. And when it fractured completely. A landowner whose estate depended on that trade network, who grew cash crops for export, relied on imported tools, and needed urban markets to sell his surplus, was stranded the moment the network stopped functioning. The supply chains that had given his land value disappeared. The markets that had bought his crops vanished. The land was still there. Its economic function was gone. The estates that survived were built on a very different logic. The self-sufficient villa, in the late imperial period, wasn't just a farm. It was a closed-loop economy. Grain, vegetables, meat, timber, wool, leather, basic metalwork, all of it produced internally. The estate maintained its own smiths, carpenters, and physicians for the laborers who worked it. Pottery was fired in estate kilns. Cloth was woven by estate workers. When the trade networks that had connected the empire contracted and eventually snapped, the self-sufficient villa didn't need them. It had never depended on them completely in the first place. Adrian Goldsworthy's work on the late Roman world shows that the great villa estates of Britain, Gaul, and North Africa actually expanded their self-sufficiency throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries. They added industrial workshops. They enlarged grain storage. They diversified agricultural output. They did this precisely as the broader imperial economy was contracting around them. These were deliberate strategic choices. The owners of these estates understood what the data was telling them. Complexity was becoming a liability. Self-sufficiency was the only hedge that couldn't be inflated away. There's another dimension to the villa story that deserves its own moment. The self-sufficient estate didn't just survive economically. It became a center of local political authority as the state gradually withdrew. When Roman tax collectors stopped appearing, when the legions disbanded for lack of pay, when the roads became unsafe and local administration collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction, the large villa owner filled the vacuum. He provided physical security. He provided food. He provided stable employment. He became, in effect, a local sovereign, the one constant in a landscape of dissolving institutions. Ward Perkins shows how the social relationships built around the great villa estates in the post-Roman period became the template for what later evolved into medieval feudalism. Landowners who had diversified away from imperial dependency and built internal productive capacity didn't just keep their wealth through the collapse. They became the structural foundation of the next political order. That is not merely survival. That is what it looks like when an asset doesn't just endure a collapse. It defines what comes after. Asset number 4, irreplaceable skill. Here is the sorting mechanism that every economic collapse applies without mercy. Your credential doesn't matter. The institution that validated your expertise doesn't matter. When the institutional framework that gave that credential its value collapses, the credential collapses with it. What Rome's fall revealed, and what every later collapse has confirmed, is that only 2 categories of human capability retain real exchange value when currencies fail and supply chains break. The first is the skill that addresses an immediate, unavoidable human need. The physician who can treat infection without imported medicines from Eastern trade routes. The blacksmith who can forge a plow blade from scrap iron. The miller who can turn grain into flour with nothing but stone and leverage. The carpenter who can repair a roof before the winter rains arrive. These people could eat in Rome's darkest years, not because they held coins or land or complex debt positions, but because what they produced could not be withheld, could not be inflated away, and could not be replaced by political decree. A farmer whose plow breaks in April needs a blacksmith that week. That need exists whether the denarius is worth a gram of silver or a gram of bronze, whether the emperor on the coin has been assassinated or has simply fled. The second category is the skill that enables commerce across collapsing boundaries. Rome's disintegration didn't eliminate all trade, it fragmented it. And in a fragmented landscape, the merchant who could operate across multiple competing political units, speak multiple languages, maintain trusted relationships in multiple jurisdictions, and move goods across borders that kept shifting as Germanic kingdoms carved up the old Roman world, was worth his weight in the solidi he traded in. Kyle Harper's documentation of the late Roman period shows that certain trading networks, especially those linking Eastern Mediterranean ports, remained active well into the post-Roman centuries, not at Roman scale, but functioning. The people running those networks were no longer Roman citizens in any meaningful political sense by the time the Western Empire formally disappeared. They were traders with skills, relationships, and a portable store of trusted hard currency. The state had dissolved around them. their economic function had not. What happened to the Roman professionals whose value was purely institutional? The lawyers whose work depended on Roman civil courts that no longer functioned? The imperial administrators whose salaries came from a treasury that had gone bankrupt? The military logistics officers of an army that stopped being paid? They struggled. Not all of them vanished. Some adapted. Some repurposed their knowledge to fit the new political order. But the collapse exposed the fragility of credential-based economic identity with brutal clarity. Your value in a failing system is only as durable as the system itself. The craftsman, the physician, the merchant with a portable skill set, these were the people who didn't just survive the fall of Rome. They were the ones who trained the children of the aristocrats who survived, who serviced the villas that became feudal estates, who carried the practical, technical knowledge of Roman civilization forward through the centuries we call the Dark Ages, which were dark partly because so much institutional knowledge disappeared while craft knowledge remained. Joseph Tainter's analysis of collapsing societies gets this exactly right. Complex societies sustain specialists whose entire economic function depends on the continued maintenance of that complexity. When complexity collapses, those specialists become redundant. The skills that survive are almost always the ones that still work at lower levels of complexity. The skills that function when supply chains are broken, when institutions have failed, when the state has fragmented into local strongmen and warlord territories. Rome did not preserve its legal system through the fall. It did not preserve its administrative architecture or its financial sophistication. What it preserved, imperfectly but genuinely, were its carpenters, its physicians, its grain farmers, and its metalworkers. The people who could do the irreducible things that kept human beings alive regardless of who held political power. So here is what the 4 Roman assets reveal about the permanent mechanics of collapse. Gold survived, but only the gold you could verify, weigh, and use in a direct transaction without institutional intermediaries. The paper claim on gold evaporated. The metal endured. Debt in a collapsing currency survived not as a burden, but as a hidden mechanism for transferring real wealth from those who lent to those who borrowed. Roman families who held land purchased with loans denominated in debased denarii came through one of history's most complete economic catastrophes with their positions intact, sometimes improved. Self-sufficient land survived, but only the land that deliberately severed its dependence on the surrounding complexity. The villa estate that could feed, clothe, and shelter its people without reference to trade networks or imperial supply chains didn't just endure the collapse. It became the nucleus of what came next. And irreplaceable skills survived. The ability to meet fundamental human needs when everything else has failed. Portable knowledge that no political collapse can confiscate, no inflation can erode, and no invading king can make obsolete. 4 assets, all of them rooted in one principle that Rome taught with blood and bronze coins wearing a thin silver mask. What survives a collapse is not what the system values most in prosperity. What survives is what cannot be faked, cannot be diluted, and cannot be made redundant when the system itself is gone. Rome's emperors believed they could print their way out of a fiscal crisis by striking more coins from cheaper metal. They believed a coin that merely looked like silver was functionally the same as silver. They believed the scale and complexity of their empire proved its permanence. In reality, the complexity was the vulnerability. The scale made the unraveling faster, not slower. And here is the thought worth carrying with you. Every modern financial system is more complex than Rome at its peak. Every modern currency is more thoroughly detached from tangible value than the most aggressively debased denarius. Every modern supply chain contains more single points of failure than the entire Roman trade network did at its most stretched. Rome fell slowly, and then all at once. If this changed the way you think about money, about what holds value, about what the survivors of history's greatest collapses actually held, then it did what history is supposed to do. It gave you the pattern. The answers are always there. The hard part is seeing what remains after everything else disappears.